So I thought it would be cool to do a video on female sex hormones and some important things to be aware of when we want to maximize their production and help to encourage a healthy balance in these hormones. So the first thing we need to consider is that when we are making these hormones, we require both of them in order to produce each other. What do I mean by this? Okay, so we need enough progesterone to be able to be converted to other steroid hormones in the body. So we convert progesterone to our cortisol, to our aldosterone, to testosterone, and then that will get converted into estrogen. So it makes a lot of sense that we require progesterone in the first place to be able to produce our estrogen. But it's also important to acknowledge that we require enough estrogen to be released out into the body to actually be able to ovulate an egg. And it's that ovulation of the egg that actually then allows us to start producing more progesterone from our corpus luteum. I won't go into too much detail on that right now, that's for another video. But as I said, it's important to acknowledge that both of these hormones almost regulate each other. Another really important point is that in order to make the progesterone in the first place, we actually require a very special molecule, and that is cholesterol. So we're actually going to take our cholesterol and we're going to convert it into progesterone first. That progesterone will then be converted into cortisol and aldosterone. That will then be converted into testosterone, and then from testosterone we can produce estrogen. Really important to understand there. So it goes without saying that if you don't have adequate levels of cholesterol, like for example, you've been told to completely avoid it in your diet, or you're on something like a statin, which actually prevents the production of cholesterol in the first place, you may have a really hard time actually being able to produce enough of your sex hormones like progesterone and estrogen. Another thing to acknowledge here too is that, as I said, we're going to use progesterone to convert into other hormones, not just estrogen and testosterone. We're actually going to use it to also make our cortisol and our aldosterone. Now, these hormones are really important for survival. One, because we use cortisol to make a stress response, and aldosterone is actually also used to regulate our blood pressure. So it makes huge sense that if we are not eating enough cholesterol, we don't have enough in our body at any given time, we are actually going to prioritize as humans the hormones that allow us to survive another day rather than the ones that are going to help us procreate. So it's important to understand that we need enough cholesterol to not only produce our stress hormones, but also then have enough to then produce our sex hormones. I think that's a really important point. Another important point here is that we do something with these hormones once they're produced, and that is we metabolize them. What does that mean? Well, metabolism is basically where we will take these hormones and then we need to be able to conjugate them so that they become more water soluble. Why would we want to do this? Well, the body's really good at regulating things like our hormones. It never likes to have too many or too little. So it has a really great process that occurs in the liver, where it will basically take the hormones and stick something like, for example, a methyl group or a sulfate group or something like that, that is going to make the molecule more water soluble. Why is that important? Well, we need to be able to excrete these hormones if we have any excess. So once these molecules have been conjugated, they're then able to be put into the urine and we can excrete them via the urine, get rid of them essentially. So it makes sense that if we have some issue going on with the liver, our liver health isn't fantastic, then we may have trouble with this conjugation step, and then we may end up getting a buildup of those hormones in our body. So it stands to reason that anything that could be harmful to the liver, like for example, excessive consumption of alcohol, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, some kind of biliary obstruction, a stone, some kind of disease process that occurs within the liver could affect its ability to actually conjugate these molecules and get rid of any excess of them. Another important point that can often indicate some kind of issue with the liver's ability to metabolize these hormones, like for example estrogen, is the byproducts. So we have different types of estrogen in the body. We actually have 3 different types. And so we have E1, which is called estrone. We have E2, which is estradiol, and that is the one that we see most abundantly in the body. And then we have E3, which I'm not going to talk about here because that's just one that we would only really see in a pregnant female. But the estrone is often associated with some negative things in the body, like having a lower HDL level and having, gallstones and cholestasis. So we don't like to see too much of this estrone in the body. It's the estradiol that we like to see higher levels of. That is the healthier version of estrogen. So it makes sense that if there's some issue going on with the health of the liver and we're converting too much of our estrogen into the estrone, then there's some issue going on here and we need to look into our liver health. So we've talked about the fact that we require cholesterol in order to make these hormones in the first place. What about carbohydrates? Now, a lot of people talk about the fact that we require carbohydrates in order to make healthy hormones. In a way, this is true, and that's because we do require energy in all of our cells in order to actually do their functions. And if we're talking about, for example, our female sex glands, like our ovaries, we obviously require enough energy to be able to do these processes. But I think an important point here is that you don't necessarily need to be actually consuming a huge deal of carbohydrates in order to have enough glucose to be able to use as energy. So there's a couple of things that we require in order to be able to supply glucose to cells that need it, and that is insulin sensitivity. So if our insulin is not being responded to by our tissue and we have become insulin resistant due to metabolic syndrome, being overweight, things like that, then while we might have enough glucose floating around in our blood, the insulin isn't able to do its job and basically allow that glucose into cells. Another really important thing that we require actually is our ability to go through something called gluconeogenesis, which is our ability to make endogenous glucose within our body, in our liver. And once again, the liver comes into it. We require enough liver health to be able to produce our own glucose when we have not consumed any in our diet. So in my opinion, it's not about consuming a huge deal of carbohydrates in order to make healthy hormones. It's about our body being able to use glucose that we have in our body and to be able to also make endogenous glucose when we require it. So last point on female hormones, specifically estrogen, that I think you might want to know. And this actually is something that's relevant to both males and females. Remember how I said we take a big molecule called cholesterol and we use it to make progesterone, and then from there we take that progesterone and we can produce testosterone and then estrogen. Now, it's actually in our body fat that we have a very special enzyme called aromatase. And aromatase job is to basically convert testosterone into estrogen. And so it stands to reason that you require enough body fat to have enough aromatase to take your testosterone and convert it into estrogen. So it also makes sense that if you are too lean, you may have a bit of a problem producing enough estrogen and you may not be able to ovulate an egg successfully each month. It also stands to reason that if you are overweight and contain excess amounts of body fat, then of course you're going to have more aromatase, which means that you will convert more testosterone into estrogen. I think this is important to note, both in males and females, because they both have aromatase in their body fat. So if you're a male and you have excess body fat, and you also really want to have nice amounts of testosterone, you may want to consider possibly losing some body fat because you're going to be converting more of your testosterone into estrogen. Same goes with a female. If you have issues of excess estrogen and you are overweight, you may want to think about trying to lose some body fat in order to regulate your hormones.